Here I want to go into the specific process of how a paper becomes published, and I'm going to take an academic involvement. It could be someone in a company, it really doesn't matter that much. Talk about a new researcher. In the academic environment, the new researcher will have to have some kind of an idea. They'll have to put this idea in writing to get funds for their students and their technicians and their postdoctoral fellows or undergraduate students who might be doing this particular research, and hope that that particular document, their research proposal, will be favored by the granting agencies. Usually the funding agencies are major in the country to deliver the bulk of the money, although companies do indeed give research funds and foundations give research funds. This is also a peer review process, so the same that will apply to what I'm going to say through the publication process applies to the engagement of getting a research grant. And of course, money is all important. It costs a lot of money to engage graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and buy the scientific equipment that's necessary for the research. So let's fast forward and assume that a grant is secured. Some time passes, there's a result or maybe a couple of results, and it's time to publish perhaps a communication, because that's often what early young researchers will do. They want to get their name out there so that people know who they are. And so I'm going to try to describe the peer review process and some of the details of that process. This is very general, but it applies pretty much to all manner of research involvement, getting those papers into the journals. There are some kinds of publications that do not deal with peer review, and they are not really regarded very highly by many in the scientific community, but this is all about peer review. So we have to start with that researcher, and the researcher can be doing any number of things, some complicated chemical process, analysis of food items, what it might be, and these are of course exaggerated cartoons that we've been able to obtain. And they might be doing something like that. They might be gathering samples if they're looking at water science, as it might be, or some biology in the water. Or it might be somebody working in a fume hood with sensitive chemicals, or maybe in some kinds of sensitive equipment that's necessary. So that researcher has to contend with an editor. Exaggerated here, as you see, the accept pile is very small. The inbox is very large, and the reject box is very significant. I think many researchers feel that that's the way it actually goes. Most papers eventually get published, not necessarily in the journal of choice. Most researchers like to put their work in the best possible journal. That's the way to get one's name into the community. So you have to contend with an editor, sometimes more than one editor, but usually a single editor, or often a single editor. And then you have to contend with one or more referees. It depends on the journal and the field of endeavor, but there might be as few as one referee. Usually there are 2 or 3 referees, sometimes as many as 4, maybe even more, but 2 or 3 referees are pretty common. And here the referee has to read the paper, and they judge the paper. They do not redo the work. It's simply way too complicated to do that. What they wind up doing is judging whether they think that the references are appropriate, that credit has been given, that the paper reads properly, that there are no typographical errors. These days, with the computer capacities, we don't have that, although scientific words sometimes get misspelled because they're more complicated. And that facts are appropriate, and that the facts give one to lead to the appropriate and correct conclusion. So the researcher will send the paper to the editor. The editor will then look through a list, sometimes with a few people provided by the researcher as suggestions, although this need not be honored. The editor will think, okay, I have 10 people who are working in this area that the researcher is working in. I'm going to select 2 or 3 people to review this paper. They then send the paper to the referee. If it's a communication that's not too long and it's really urgent, most referees will respond in a matter of a very few days. editors want this back. They pound you with emails to say, you've had a week, you've had 2 weeks, you've had 3 weeks, this is enough time, we need your response. And of course, if you're getting 3 people who may be traveling or busy, it might take a little longer. But normally in a matter of about a month, a response can be obtained. And the referee then sends back their comments to the editor. The editor may say, after reading this set of comments, that this is a great paper, nothing needs to be changed. That's a little bit rare, but it happens. Or they may have some comments to make about what the referee has said, namely, pay attention to points 2 and 3 because you will have to correct these or respond to these. They send that data to the researcher. And the researcher, if they're lucky the first time, maybe the paper can be published very, very quickly. Usually the researcher has to rebut some of the comments that the referee has made. Maybe the referee was in error, or maybe a good point was made by the referee to correct the paper, and the researcher then sends it back to the editor, who at that point most often can make a decision whether the paper will be published or not. There are a few cases where they'll send it back to the referee to say, was this okay? Did you agree that this has been, any problems that you had have been sorted out? That goes back to the editor. And then it's the decision time for that editor. Well, they then, of course, communicate that decision to the researcher. If it's sort of a bad report and the paper is ultimately not going to be published, the researcher can then send that paper to another journal. It's considered extremely bad form for the researcher to send the same paper at the same time to more than one journal, because it would be rather easily discovered, because some of the referees might have the same paper to adjudicate from 2 different journals, and that would put a very bad mark on that researcher. But let's hope in this case that the researcher was successful and the paper indeed will be published. The researcher is very pleased. They can go back to doing their work. But what I want to make clear in this process, the normal peer review process shows only these interchanges that you see here. In no case, in most all peer review processes, does the referee's identity become known by the researcher. This has a lot of sociological implications and ego implications, as I'm sure you can immediately appreciate. And so it's blind in that direction of the researcher and the referee. The researcher should not know who the referee is. Some years ago, when not Xerox copies, but copies that were made by carbon copies, old-fashioned carbon copies, I actually received the name in a couple of papers by mistake of who the referee was. It makes for a very interesting situation when you meet up with them and you really should never talk about your experience and knowing who that referee was. But that's a very rare situation, and I think hardly ever happens these days. So the researcher can then engage in whatever they were engaged in. Now, the rebuttal of criticism is a tricky business. I think it was posed very well by the Peanuts cartoon that you see here. You're supposed to print them and make me rich and famous. And I've sometimes thought on a rejected paper, because we all get rejected papers now and then, what is it with you? I don't think that would go over too well. Well, one interesting case of a rejected paper took place with Sir Hans Alfred Krebs, Adolf Krebs, and you can appreciate by the Sir in just in front of his first name that he was a famous researcher and indeed eventually won a Nobel Prize for the Krebs cycle that many who might be looking at this have experienced in biochemistry or chemistry class. Well, this is the rejection letter that was received in 1937. The editor of Nature, and then it's a fill in the blank, basically rejecting the paper. But I'm told that in his family there exists a simultaneous framed document shown here with a whole bunch of signatures, and the language is Swedish, and the signatures of the king, because that's his Nobel Prize. Eventually, his publication was made public, and it bred a Nobel Prize. And there are a couple of other examples of that, with magnetic resonance imaging for one. The initial paper was rejected by Nature, eventually accepted, and then the Nobel Prize awarded, because they just didn't think at the time that it was a valuable paper.